Hello and welcome to part 3 of Tech's 4-part HDR presentation. Today's presentation discusses the nonlinear processing, often loosely referred to as gamma, as well as the increase in displayable colors or wide color gamut. These two form essentially the flux capacitor that makes a truly better video experience possible. My name is Dan Baker, and I'm a principal engineer in the Tektronix Video Products Group. Today's presenter is Steve Holmes, application engineer with the video product line at Tektronix. During the presentation, please type any questions you might have in the Q&A window, and we'll answer as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation. You can download a copy of today's slides by clicking on the Resources widget on your screen. In addition, a link to the archived webinar will be sent to you next week. With that, we'll turn it over to Steve.
Welcome to part 3 of our 4-part series on 4K and HDR. I'm Steve Holmes, a video application engineer for Tektronix. In part 1, we covered 4K video formats, sampling, color, waveforms, link timing. In part 2, we did an overview of HDR, talked about nits, light levels, tone mappings, and some of the standards. In this part, we'll cover display gammas, curves, color space, levels, and look at a little bit on waveforms. So we'll look at display curves, gamma, talk about gamma a little bit, and look at color space in 709p3 in 2020, and a little bit about HDR levels and waveforms. So, gamma. We've got a few questions here. Was gamma a CRT defect? Not really. So gamma was caused by the voltage to current drive of the CRT and not the phosphor. If we didn't do a voltage drive of the grid on a CRT and we did a current drive of a CRT, it would be absolutely flat and linear. So was it a need to match the human response, visual response? Not really. As long as the display reproduces the scene correctly, it doesn't matter how it got there, as long as it undoes whatever is done in the transmission so that it presents the data to you as it was actually acquired. Can you adjust gamma? Well, that actually happens almost every day for everybody. Most TVs today have a actual Lightroom sensor so that they keep a contrast or a given brightness based on the room brightness level and keeps right on going. So every time that brightness or that black level is adjusted, it actually changes the gamma function. So a gamma for a CRT is pretty consistent at 2.4. But what about flat panels? Well, since flat panels are going to get the same data that is being presented to a CRT base, and you really don't know from the transmission side of the house whether it's going to go to a CRT or a flat panel, the BT 1886 standard came up and said that all flat panels must be calibrated to a 2.4 gamma so that the light level is exactly the same as what the acquisition was, and it will look correct. Well, why not get rid of the gamma power law? Well, we have for some aspects of this in cameras. They don't always use a 709 gamma. In cameras today, quite often, they're shot in log, which is a power function. It's a log2 function to be able to extend the stop range of the cameras, and then the data can be brought back into either a 2.4 gamma or into an HDR curve to be correct for viewing. In today's gamma, if we were to shoot things absolutely linear, and on the right-hand side, the camera's response was linear, we looked at a chart that was a grayscale chart, it would require 15 bits of data to be able to give us 100 steps. And we would need better than 90 dB of SNR to be able to get there. And so in today's environment, in 8 bits for most encoding, we would not be able to have 100 steps and would lose the bottom end of that picture completely. It just so happens, it turns out that with today's gamma curve, when we shoot something and we use the 2.4 gamma curve, we can get the 100 steps in 7 bits and have the complete display, and we undo that curve back in the TV set. So even though it was kind of a fluke that that was the drive based on the voltage to current ratio of grid drive of a CRT, we would have to have put some form of curve in anyway in order to make television have good contrast ratio and still be within acceptable SNR rates or levels. So the human eye's sensitivity to light, our eye is quite a bit more sensitive to the changes in light in low light levels than it is up in high bright light levels. Think about some of the MPEG-2 or H.264 video you've seen where you see a gray area in the video and you see it kind of swimming. It's a little bit of a mosaic in that gray, but you look at the white levels in that same shot and they're absolutely pristine. The same swimming is going on in those white levels. It's just our eye is not as sensitive to that swimming in the white as it is in the black. So one of the things the PQ curve does is it actually increases the dynamic range for black levels so that we have more data in the blacks and we can actually give better resolution in blacks than we can in 709. So the Barton curve is the threshold that Barton came up with by looking at several subjects and now looking at the eye's contrast curve to light. And the 2084 curve was positioned after that so that with 12 bits and 1,000 nits, we could actually come and stay well under that Barton curve and be able to display the contrast ratios that the human eye actually sees. So with a 709 gamma, if you look on the chart, you can see where 100 nits would be, and this chart has it actually going all the way out to 400 nits, but we normally clip the signal right around 100 or 200 depending on the monitor that's actually being displayed. In hybrid log gamma, at 100 nits, we actually apply a log function from that point on. From 100 nits down, it is the 2.4 gamma, but from 100 nits up to 1200 nits, it is a log function that would be able to show the data that would normally be rolled off in the camera knee when the camera was set up in the 709 environment, so that we can show, and we have the extra data room to be able to show those specular highlights. The 2084 PQ curve, if you notice, the black line actually goes to the left of where the 2.4 gamma. That's the extra data in the blacks that we get, and the slightly better resolution in blacks that we get that we don't get in the standard gamma curve. So one of the things it gives us, besides going all the way out to 10,000 nits, it gives us a little better range in the blacks to be able to reproduce those better. If we kind of look at a CIE chart and look at the different color spaces from a triangle point of view and not a pure volume point of view, laid on top of one another, you can see where blue, where red, where green is in each one of these color spaces based off of the D65 white point sitting in the center of the chart. So the unique thing for SDI is that it is linear and knows nothing about color space. So the same digital value will point to the color that the receiver has been set to. So 3AC is the normal SMPTE level for 100%. It would be 100% green, 100% red, or 100% blue. Same 3AC hex value would be 100% P3, green, blue, and red if the receiver was switched to P3 translation of the SDI data it was coming in. Also, that same 3AC point is 100% green, blue, or red within 2020. So it is how the receiver is set to how it interprets the digital data that is actually coming down an SDI pipe. So the same exact green could be 100% 709, could be 100% P3, or it could be 100% 2020. We actually took, so you can see that same signal here on each one of them presented one by one, looking at these. So the translation between each one, then you can see next to each other here. We actually took a rainbow pattern that we have that is all colors at all levels and put it on a device that shows the triangle set in 709. The receiver was set to 709. It was a 709 signal that was applied to it. All we did is take the receiver and told the receiver, you are now 2020. We left the same 709 signal applied to it because the receiver says, oh, now that 3AC hex is 100% of 2020 space, that same exact signal now filled the entire 2020 triangle. So from a SDI perspective, it doesn't know what color space, so it can't tell you what color space you're in by filling one triangle or filling the other triangle, since the data values are exactly the same for 709, P3, or 2020. Video levels, there's different video levels. Typically, we talk in terms of full levels or SMPTE levels for SDI. And in files, quite often full levels means 0 to 1023 bits for a 10-bit file. But in SDI, the bottom 4 code values and the top 4 code values are excluded from being used because they are part of the TRS. So they are part of the timing reference signals, or the SAV, EAV markers that mark the beginning of active video and the end of active video. So in SDI, that 0 to 1023 range is 4 to 1019. Now, how a file gets converted from 0 to 1023 to 4 to 1019 is dependent on the output device, whether it's clipped off or whether it's scaled down to fit that space. The only way to find that would be to put a ramp signal that went from 0 to 1023 and see if the beginning and the end of the ramp was flat. If the beginning and the end of the ramp had a few pixels that were flat, then the device is just chopping the data off to 4 to 1019. If it goes from the far left to the far right as a nice, clean, smooth ramp, then it has been rescaled back down to that level and it's actually going to be slightly better. So for narrow or full, narrow meaning SMPTE levels, full meaning full 10-bit within what we have to live with, there's the different levels here that you can see. For files, that would be changed then for different things for SDI based on the values that are set. So you can see that normal SDI levels go from a hex 40 to 3AC for a Luma. And then if we were to look at that same Luma value in full levels, it's going to go from 4 decimal to 1019 decimal for full levels. If we looked at CB or CR and not looking at RGB data, then it's going to go from 40 to 3C0 to 4 to 1019 again for the chroma channel. So normal white point or diffused white point. One thing you have to remember with HDR, it isn't really intended to make the entire picture brighter. What we want to do is make the ability to be able to show the dynamics, those specular highlights that get lopped off in a conventional 709 style shot. They get lost in the knee of the camera. So even though there's no actual agreed upon diffused white point, we still need to have a grading point. That normal 90% reflective white still needs to be set at a known point so that we have good transitions from scene to scene to scene where one doesn't look brighter, the other one look dimmer, because it may or may not have dynamic metadata to kind of help us out in some of these pieces. So the normal thinking here is that we're going to use the normal 100 nit, maybe 200 nit as our diffused white point. So if you were shooting somebody's white shirt that would normally come back at 100% in 709, you need to have a reference point that you need to carry throughout your clip, and then look for your grading point, whether it's 1,000 nit, 2,000 nits, 540 nits, that you allow the speculars to go in. And we have the same thing that we need to watch even if we shoot in log off of a camera. So if we look at a shot in HDR, it's going to look much different looking at a waveform than what it would look like if we were to view this, what we're used to looking at 709. 100 nits, where 90% of the material is going to go from 0 to 51% of the screen. The area from 51% to the top of the screen, which would be 10,000 nits, is reserved for the specular highlight room. But most monitors can't do that, so most of the grading is done today at about 1,000 nits as the typical average. So the range from 51% to 76% then would be for specular highlights. So here's a shot with the material going up to 1,000 nits. You can see the material is lopped off. It's pretty much stopping on the red and the green trace. The blue doesn't have a lot of speculars in it in this particular shot, but the red and the green trace do have material going right up to 1,000 nits in this particular shot. Notice that the blacks are expanded from what we're typically used to looking at 709, where you get a lot of data down at the bottom right at 0, and it's all kind of munched. So this is a typical 2084 10K curve, but with the data being graded to 1,000 nits for the monitors. Here's the same display, but looking at a reflectance view, because quite often we want to see where's our 18% neutral gray point, where is the 2% normal black, where is all of these different pieces. And if we look at this, we can actually see that our 1,000 nit point would be the equivalent of 900% reflectance, to where our 90% reflectance is the old 100 IRE point. So this particular clip has data going up into the specular range above the 90% point. Also look at the data as a relative stop view, to where we have assigned the 18% gray neutral as 0 stops, and we can tell you how many stops above that is the 100 nit point, and how many stops below that is the 2% point, all the way up to 5.6 stops above 18% would be the 1,000 nit point. So it's almost a T-stop type view, where you're actually looking at the data through the entire transfer function of the lens and the entire camera operation. So it's a relative stop view, but it does give you the range of where you would need to move something up or down if you were looking at this on a camera. This particular view right here is actually looking at a 2,000 nit grade. You can actually see the data is going up to 2,000 nits and no higher than that. And the white point is probably a little bit higher than the 51% at 100 nits in this particular scene here, but there's a lot of data going up to the 2,000 nit range. We can also look at full data or look at narrow data. In this particular shot here, this is looking at full data that is going from 4 all the way up to 1019. And you can see that black now is not at 64. Black is now below the 64 point, where narrow would have its black. It's all the way down on the bottom going up, and then the white point of the file there at 100 nits, but not a lot of speculars happening. There's a little bit of speculars in the red channel in this particular clip. If someone was to feed you standard 709 data, it's really easy to tell that you've got 709 data rather than an HDR data coming to the waveform monitor. If you look at the blacks, number one, you can see that the blacks are quite heavily sitting down, way down below on the screen, and that the data is going well up into the 10,000 nit range, because that's 100% within 709. Unfortunately, today there is no metadata being sent along that tells us anything about the color space, whether it's 709, whether it's 2020, or whether it's P3, because HDR or 4K for that matter, as we talked about in the first session, can be any one of those color spaces. So you pretty much have to look at the content and determine from the content or from notes that are coming with the file as to what the grading and what the white point of this file actually should be. There is a zoom function that we can implement on the waveform monitor so that you can zoom in this case, this is a YRGB view, and you can actually zoom into the specular highlight range so that you can actually see it expanded and see the specular highlights in more detail with the expansion. We also have the ability to do specular bright ups. This is the ability to set and look at the data that you have put into the specular range, because you have to be careful on HDR that you don't put too much data into the specular range, or the picture is going to look really, really washed out, and home monitors will actually decrease their brightness because they don't have the power to do more than about 15 to 20% of the screen at specular light ranges, up at 1,000 or 2,000 nits, depending on the monitor. So if too much of the screen gets too bright, they actually regulate the power supply down, and the entire picture goes munchy on you. You got to remember that you only want the pieces in the specular range that would be above normal 100%. So you can see the zebra striping, in this case, of the pieces of this particular clip that are in the speculars. So we have in SDI the VPID ID. And the VPID ID will tell us about the format of the video that is coming through to us. So the format of the video deals with what link is it, if it's quad link, is it 6 gig, 12 gig, is it 3G, dual link, and how are we getting this 4K HDR data to the waveform monitor or sending it. And it is sent out as 4 user data words. And it is broken down then in binary by this bit means this bit means this, these 2 bits mean this. And you pretty much have to have the magic decoder ring to turn around and break those 4 user data words down, because they are broken out in binary. We've made things much simpler for you. If you go to www.tech.com/4K, we have a magic decoder ring in the form of a very nice wall poster for you, like a lot of the wall posters we've made, that will break down the color space. It'll break down the VPID for you and gives you a lot of data about your 4K transmission and the links and what you should be receiving on your SDI link. So in SDI, if it's a quad link shot coming to you, if you look at the view on the left-hand side, and if you look at the 4th data word on the far right of each one, A, B, C, and D links, you'll see that each one of those links has a different hex value as the last data word, 0, 41, etc., going down, where it has actually called out for link 1, link 2, link 3, and link 4 IDs. But it's not uncommon to see the one on the right where each link is actually just coming out as link 1. A lot of manufacturers still aren't following the full spec, where you're supposed to be calling out that this is link 1, link 2, link 3, or link 4, and they just name everything link 1 because it's either just a standard HD signal or it's a standard 3G signal, and they've just given you 4 of them. So it's not uncommon to have both, and most gear has to be able to work with either one that you receive. But having the proper words. So if you look at these, the first 3 words all should match each other, and only the last word is allowed to be different. If you're having problems resolving your 4K data and the first 3 words are not the same, then you've got a VPID issue, and the receiver at the end is not going to know what to do. So we do decode these for you within the waveform monitor and present the data to you in the bottom left-hand corner as well as in the video session screen. So I want to thank you for your time in this and look forward to seeing and hearing from you on part 4 of our 4-part series on 4K and HDR. We will now take your questions and answer any questions that we have received during this particular broadcast. And I want to thank you very much.
Hello, this is Dan Baker again. We have some questions here. First one is about increasing the dynamic range by increasing the contrast and brightness. And also we have a question related to that about how does gamma differ from brightness. So let's